Veterans Administration, through the GI Bill, works in concert with the Federal Housing Administration, and they provide really joint loans by the late 40s for veterans to come into a house with no down payment requirements. If you can go to the next slide, give you an example of how it works. FHA provides 80% of the loan. The Veterans Administration and the VA provides 20% of the loans. They expand the repayment process to a generation, and it really makes income less significant, and also renting is cheap. This is from a guy from Corpus Christi, Texas, who is arguing that he can't get a loan. He's talking about, since getting out in 1946, I have been unable basically to take advantage of the GI Bill, looking specifically at home loans and businesses. He said under government stipulations, a veteran is entitled to a home. That's true, right, with the GI Bill. But he says in Corpus Christi, basically the GI Bill in Corpus Christi have so devised the location of residential sections and placed restrictions on certain areas that it is, under the present setup, no Negro is eligible for a loan. No Negro veteran is eligible for a loan. The commissioner estimates that less than 30,000 black veterans benefited from the housing component of the GI Bill from 1944 to 1955 when it ended. But during that same time, the VA provided almost 4 million, 3.9 and change million homes, with about 0.7%, less than 30,000, going to African American veterans. According to an estimate, while 1 in 13 veterans were African American, fewer than 30,000, or about 2.6%, ever benefited from the housing component of the GI Bill. Please. I give more detailed statistics in that piece, but I'm not going to do it here. But just to give you an example, during the same time, there was an estimate that 37% of white veterans were able to benefit from the housing component of the GI Bill, which is roughly about 14 times larger than their African American equivalents. Between the FHA and VA, you're talking about $102 billion between 34 and around 1960, with less than 2% going to non-whites. And in all, almost over 97% of African Americans, veterans, never accessed the GI Bill, the housing component of the GI Bill. Between 33 and 78, home equity is introduced to 35 million American families, but the federal government selected winners and losers, and the wealth of these families were stimulated, if they were white, many of them, and the wealth of black families was depressed because of it. And I want to talk about some of the consequences that still resonate today, just real quick. In 1940, 42% of white families were homeowners versus 23% of African American families. During this time period, about 98% of non-whites were considered black, right? In 1950, that number goes for whites, jumps up to 54%. For African Americans, it jumps high too, 35%. 1960, whites are 64% homeowners, African Americans 38%. Today, about 74% of white Americans own their homes, but only 41% own their homes today. Please. And the racial home ownership gap between whites and blacks has been growing since 1940. It's 18.8 in 1940, 19.7 in 1950, 26% in 1960, and 33% today. In 1940, this is the amount of whites who owned homes. Today, it's 41% for blacks. And so today, black Americans own 1.7% less homes per capita than their white counterparts did in 1940. And this is ultimately the legacy of the housing discrimination I want us to think about and talk about.
Legacy on wealth building among
The
African-American families?
It's a great question. First, the short answer, no. But in the article I talked about in the Journal of African American History, I used Pigford 1 and Pigford 2 to make a case for the families, because Pigford 1 and Pigford 2, it's not just the farmers who are discriminated against, it's also their families.
Yeah,
Can't get money, right?
Yeah.
And so I use those Pigford 1 and Pigford 2 as an example of potential, and I would argue that some kind of redress needs to be done for the million-plus African American World War II veterans and their families for not being able to access this government program that, if it was adequately distributed at the time, anywhere between, a conservative estimate is almost 400,000 additional African Americans would have been homeowners by 1955. a more aggressive analysis would get almost 480,000 additional by 1955 African Americans, which would have been transformative, right? Because my granddad fought in World War II, which is kind of where I started getting interested in this, and was not able to access the GI Bill component of the housing component of the GI Bill at all. It took him 21 years to buy his house, and by that time the benefits had run out, and he had to do it largely on his own volition and lost a generation of equity. And what I found was, interviewing these guys, I naively, when I was doing my dissertation on a World War II vessel that was significant that my grandfather was on, I was asking these guys, so when did you get your GI Bill? When did you get your house from the GI? And I just assumed that they got it, because everything I had ever read about the GI Bill up until that point was so positive, was talking about how transformative it was for the country, how it created the modern middle class. So I was like, when did you get yours? And they were like, huh?
Yeah.
And it took them a decade to a generation to get it, if they got homes at all.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't get that, they really didn't get it at all in the sense that it was something you were supposed to get right out of service. It was cheap, you could buy a house in Levittown, it was cheaper than renting.
That's right. And in Levittown, we're from, my folks are from Long Island, right? And well, my grandparents from Louisiana moved the family to the Bronx, and then my granddad moved the family out in '66 to Long Island, and so he was able to buy a house later. But Levittown was segregated in Long Island through the 1960s, and at least through 1960, and those homes today, those Levittown homes, they go for anywhere from $750,000 to $1 million plus. And so if you have a $6,000 investment that you make, for example, with no down payment required from the GI Bill, and that translates into $1 million plus property, that is a game changer for your family. Yeah. And no black people who are able to access Levittown through at least 1960 in Long Island, and maybe and potentially even later. And so my granddad was able to benefit by buying a house kind of on his own volition, and we were able to benefit too. But when we sold our house, it was not near my granddad's house. It was not near that kind of money. And so it has transformative implications. Just to give you an example of some of those implications too, real quick, a very recent racial wealth gap study that came out this year looked at the gap between African American wealth and white wealth. And they argue that African Americans families on average, and averages are not great because Oprah's an average, right? And Bill Gates is an average, but they used average as an example. So I think this overstates the argument. They said that about African American families have about $85,000 in net wealth, all your assets minus all your debt. White families, they said, on average, had about $656,000 of net wealth. And that they looked at the rate of net wealth growth over the last 30 years and estimated that if the rate of growth for black families continues over the next several years that it had for the last 30, that it would take the average African American family 228 years to approximate the amount of wealth that white families have now. So by the year 2244, average black families would have the same wealth that white families have in 2016. When I saw that, I was like, just blew me away. But you can see how this has generational implications. Other thoughts? A great point, great question. Thank you.
Well, when you just said that, you made me think about the demographic shift that is proposed to happen by that time.
Right.
And so then you will have a majority minority that is under-resourced.
Oh, there's no question about it. Oh, you're absolutely right. The demographics will, as a nation, we're going to be inequality is bad now. Stay tuned as we get more majority minority, because in terms of wealth, there was another statistic looking at single women of color, and it called Lifting as We Climb, that came out a few years ago, and the wealth gap there, they were saying that single black women, on average, median, have $5 of net wealth between the years of 36 and 49, and virtually no single black women have wealth at all before age 50. And so you think about how many black and brown families are raised in single homes, to your point about demographic shifts and under resources or under being on the poorer side of things.